Dakota Territory, late September. The prairie had not yet decided what kind of winter it would bring. The grass still held a dull gold color, bent low by steady winds that came without warning and left just as quickly. Mornings were cool but tolerable. Afternoons carried a thin, deceptive warmth that made men work harder than they should have, believing they still had time. Across the settlement, cabins were going up fast. Axes rang from dawn until dusk. Logs were dragged into place, notched, stacked, and chinked in long horizontal lines. Smoke already curled from a few stone chimneys, thin and hopeful, as families rushed to finish before the first hard frost sealed the ground. Experience told them this was the window that mattered. Miss it, and winter would decide the rest for you. And yet, on the western edge of the claim line, Jonas Whitaker was still hammering. Not raising walls, not fitting a roof. He was covering his cabin. Tall pine boards, rough sawn, pale and straight, ran vertically from just above the stone foundation to beneath the eaves. One by one, he lifted them into place and nailed them over logs that were already solid, already tight, already considered finished by every standard of frontier building. From a distance, it looked wrong. The cabin no longer showed the proud horizontal lines of exposed timber that marked skill and effort. The craftsmanship beneath was hidden, sealed away behind a second skin of wood. To anyone passing by, it appeared unfinished, or worse, wasteful. The wind cut across the open land, slipping through coats and collars with practiced ease. It rattled loose grass, pressed against unfinished walls, and searched relentlessly for gaps. Jonas worked with his back to it, steady and unhurried, as if the season were not closing in at all. Nearby, men paused in their own labor to watch. They had seen this before, newcomers with ideas borrowed from somewhere else, ideas that rarely survived a Dakota winter. Most learned quickly. A few learned too late. Jonas ignored the looks. He measured carefully, aligning each board so it ran true and straight, knowing full well that nothing beneath it was perfectly even. Logs were round. Boards were flat. They would never meet cleanly, and he did not want them to. Each strike of the hammer echoed across the prairie, sharp and deliberate. 6 nails per board. Sometimes 7. Enough to hold fast, but not so many that the wood could not move when the cold came. September slipped toward its end. At night, frost began to appear on the low ground. Water left in shallow pans skinned over by morning. The wind shifted more often now, carrying a sharper edge. A hint of something heavier waiting beyond the horizon. Still, Jonas kept working. He left the bottom edges of the boards several inches above the soil, a detail few noticed and fewer understood. He overlapped the top carefully beneath the eaves, creating a continuous outer surface that wrapped the cabin from corner to corner. Where 2 boards met, he marked the seam, already planning where narrow battens would later be added on the windward side. Inside, the cabin remained quiet. No fire burned yet. No furniture cluttered the space. It was a shell, bare floor, bare walls, a single stove waiting patiently at the center. Jonas wanted the structure finished before he trusted it with heat. To the rest of the settlement, the message was clear enough. While others prepared to live, Jonas was still building. While families hurried to seal cracks and stack firewood, he spent his days adding what looked like unnecessary weight and expense. Good lumber, nailed over good logs, just as winter pressed closer. Men shook their heads as they passed. They believed winter was something you fought with fire. Jonas believed winter was something you prepared for long before the fire was ever lit. The prairie wind did not care who was right. It only tested what stood in its way. By the first week of October, the comments had stopped being quiet. They surfaced the way all frontier judgments did, around barrels at the general store, near the stove where men thawed their hands, and in half-laughing remarks passed from one builder to another. No one confronted Jonas Whitaker directly. They didn't need to. In a small settlement, disapproval traveled faster than gossip. Men who had raised cabins for decades watched his progress with narrowed eyes. These were not amateurs. They were builders shaped by Ohio winters, Pennsylvania hills, and years of log work done the same way their fathers had done it. They knew the weight of good timber, the sound of a tight notch seating properly, the look of chinking packed just right with clay and straw. To them, a cabin's strength was meant to be seen, not hidden. Covering logs like he's ashamed of them, one man muttered. Another laughed. Man builds a barn around a house. They measured skill by speed. A good builder finished before the weather turned. A smart builder trusted his fire and his chinking. Anything beyond that felt like uncertainty dressed up as innovation. Jonas's cabin challenged something deeper than technique. It questioned confidence. Every vertical board he nailed into place erased visible proof of craftsmanship. The corners disappeared beneath flat planes of wood. The familiar rhythm of log courses was gone. What remained looked less like a frontier cabin and more like something unfinished, something borrowed from elsewhere. Experienced men took this personally. They had survived winters already. They had buried neighbors, rebuilt chimneys, patched walls after storms. Their methods had worked often enough to feel unquestionable. When Jonas added narrow battens over select seams, sealing them tighter on the windward side, the criticism sharpened. "Must be nice," someone said, "to waste lumber when the rest of us are counting nails." They spoke of costs, of board feet, of how many cords of wood a man could buy instead. In a place where cash was scarce and winter was long, excess was not forgiven easily. Yet beneath the mockery lay something unspoken. Dakota Territory was not like the places they came from. The land was wide, flat, and exposed. Wind did not slow here. It gathered strength across miles of open ground and pressed itself against every wall with patience and force. Some men felt it, late at night, when fires burned low and the walls seemed to breathe. Still, tradition held firm. Logs 8 to 10 inches thick. Heavy chinking. Big fires. That was how cabins had always been built. That was how families stayed alive. Anything else felt like doubt, and doubt was dangerous on the frontier. Jonas heard the laughter. He saw the looks. He said nothing. He worked the way men do when they are certain not of approval, but of necessity. Each board went up straight and true. Each nail was driven with the same measured force. He did not rush, even as the days shortened and the sun slipped lower across the prairie. Experience told the others that winter could be beaten with heat. Jonas Whitaker carried a quieter understanding. Some winters do not fight fair. Jonas Whitaker did not argue because the answer was not something he could explain quickly. It was not a trick. It was not a theory he had read in a book. It was memory, formed long before Dakota, long before land claims and survey lines. In a place where winter arrived sideways on the wind and never asked permission. He had grown up far from the prairie, along a cold northern coast where the sea never fully froze and the air never truly rested. There, winter did not announce itself with snow alone. It came with pressure, with wind that pressed against walls for days at a time, carrying moisture, salt, and cold in equal measure. As a boy, Jonas had learned early that cold itself was survivable. Wind was not. Houses in that country were not built to show strength. They were built to endure it. Timber frames stood behind layers of boarding, and no one expected the structural wall to face the weather directly. The outer skin took the punishment. The inner wall stayed dry, still and protected. Older men taught him this without words. He remembered watching snow blow horizontally across open ground, only to fall harmlessly at the base of a well-boarded house. He remembered stepping inside after hours outdoors and feeling the air change, not suddenly, but steadily, like moving into calm water after rough seas. There were no roaring fires inside those homes, no desperate feeding of stoves through the night. Heat was used carefully, almost sparingly, because the building itself did most of the work. What stayed with him most was the silence. When wind struck a poorly built shed, you heard it. Boards rattled, gaps whistled, walls breathed. But inside a properly layered house, the storm sounded distant, muffled, as if it belonged to another place entirely. Years later, on the Dakota Prairie, that same sound returned. The wind here had no salt, no spray, but it carried something just as dangerous, distance. It ran unbroken for miles, gathering force, testing every corner and seam. Jonas heard it pressing against the cabins at night, probing for weakness. He saw men respond the only way they knew how. Bigger fires, more wood, more chinking packed into cracks that would open again with the next freeze. But memory told him that heat alone could not win this fight. The mistake most builders made was assuming winter attacked straight on. In truth, it slipped sideways. It entered through joints. It rode moving air. It stole warmth not by force, but by persistence. In the old country, the answer had never been thicker walls alone. It was separation, space, still air trapped where the wind could not reach. Jonas understood something many around him had not yet learned. A cabin does not fail because it is cold outside. It fails because the wind is allowed inside. So when he stood before his log walls in the summer of 1880, He did not see strength. He saw exposure. He saw joints that would move, chinking that would crack, logs that would bleed heat with every gust once winter began to press. Covering the logs was not an act of doubt. It was an act of respect for a force that never tired, never argued, and never forgave mistakes. The wind had taught him that lesson as a child. Dakota was about to teach it again. By midsummer of 1880, Jonas Whitaker had already made the choice that would set him apart from his neighbors. It was not made lightly. On the frontier, every dollar carried weight. Cash was rare, often earned only after months of labor and risk. Most families measured wealth not in money, but in stored grain, livestock that survived the winter, and stacks of firewood high enough to promise survival. Jonas counted his money carefully before he spent it. At the mill downriver, he ordered rough-sawn pine boards, long, straight, and heavier than anything needed to simply frame a roof or build a door. 1 inch thick, 12 inches wide, 14 to 16 feet long. Enough to cover his entire cabin top to bottom. The cost was enough to make other men shake their heads. That money could have bought another yoke of oxen, more fencing, a season's worth of seed, or, most sensibly in their minds, several cords of firewood to burn through the coming winter. Jonas bought the lumber anyway. He did not think in terms of a single season. He thought in terms of repetition. How many winters would he spend kneeling in frozen mud, forcing fresh clay into cracks that would open again by spring? How many hours would be lost to repairs that did nothing to solve the problem beneath them? Firewood, once burned, was gone forever. Labor spent each year on the same failing joints vanished just as quickly. But a properly built wall worked every day, every night, without asking for attention. Jonas calculated the weight of the boards, the number of nails required, the time it would take to raise and secure each piece. He understood the risk. If he was wrong, he would have spent nearly a season's income to gain nothing but ridicule and a cabin no warmer than the rest. If he was right, the savings would come quietly. Fewer trips for wood, fewer repairs, fewer nights spent feeding a stove that never seemed full enough. The work began in late July. Heat shimmered above the prairie as Jonas lifted the first boards into place. Each one had to be positioned carefully, aligned vertically so it would shed water and meet the eaves cleanly. He worked alone most days, setting temporary braces, checking plumb, driving heavy nails with slow, deliberate strikes. There was no speed in this kind of labor, only accuracy. He left space where others would have forced a tight fit, not out of carelessness, but intent. The boards were not meant to press against the logs. They were meant to stand apart, creating a layer that did not belong to either the inside or the outside world. When neighbors passed, they saw only cost. Jonas saw time. Time saved in winter. Time not spent chasing heat that slipped away with the wind. Time to work, to rest, to endure. By the time August faded into September, his decision was set in wood and iron. There would be no turning back, no easy corrections once the cold arrived. The frontier offered few chances to test ideas gently. Jonas had placed his wager against the coming winter, and winter never allowed a second bet. Once the decision was made, the work became methodical. Jonas Whitaker did not rush the sheathing. He treated it as something closer to clothing a body than finishing a building. The cabin already stood solid on its stone foundation, its log walls tight and carefully chinked. What he added now was not strength in the usual sense. It was protection. Each pine board was raised vertically, one at a time, and set so it ran from just above the foundation to beneath the eaves. This orientation was deliberate. Vertical boards shed wind-driven rain and snow more easily, and they did not trap moisture the way horizontal layers sometimes could. Water moved down and away, not sideways into joints. He fastened every board at each log course beneath it. 6 nails, sometimes 7, enough to hold the board firm, but not so many that it became rigid. Wood had to move. Anyone who forgot that learned quickly, usually when boards split under winter stress. Jonas left room for expansion and contraction, trusting the fasteners to hold position without fighting the material itself. The logs beneath were round. The boards were flat. They touched only at the highest points. Everywhere else, narrow gaps formed naturally, 1/4 inch here, 1/2 inch there, wider where a log curved sharply away. Jonas made no attempt to fill these spaces. He welcomed them. What he created was not a solid mass, but a field of narrow, vertical cavities running from the base of the cabin to the roofline. Thousands of small pockets, each too tight for wind to move freely through, each capable of holding air still. Still air was the goal. Along the bottom edge, he held the boards several inches above the soil. That small gap prevented moisture from wicking upward and kept insects and rot at bay. Above, the boards tucked cleanly beneath the eaves, where overhang protected them from direct exposure and guided water away from the wall. On the sides that faced the prevailing winds, Jonas went further. Where two boards met, he added narrow battens, thin strips of wood fastened over the seams. These sealed the most vulnerable lines without closing the space behind them. Wind could strike the outer surface, but it could not find a straight path inward. From the outside, the cabin no longer looked like a frontier log structure. Its walls were smooth and vertical, more like a finished house than a temporary shelter. To many eyes, it seemed overbuilt. Inside, nothing had changed. The logs remained untouched, protected from sun, snow, and wind. The chinking stayed dry and shaded. No drafts reached the interior wall. No seams whistled when the wind rose. Jonas understood what others did not yet see. The cabin now had two jobs being done by two different layers. The outer skin faced the weather. The inner wall held the warmth. Between them lay the quiet space where winter lost its advantage. It was not an invention. It was not clever in the way new ideas often are. It was simply the careful placement of wood, space, and patience, assembled with the expectation that the wind would do its worst. And soon it would. Jonas Whitaker never spoke of science. He did not use words like convection or thermal resistance. Those belonged to classrooms and papers he had never seen. But he understood the behavior of heat the way working men always have, by watching what it does when you stop forcing it. Most frontier cabins lost warmth in two ways. The first was obvious. Heat rose. It climbed toward the ceiling, slipped up the chimney, and vanished into the night. Men tried to fight this with bigger fires and heavier stoves, feeding them until the metal glowed and the air near the roof grew stifling. The second loss was quieter and far more dangerous. Moving air. When wind struck a cabin built from exposed logs, it did not stop at the wall. It pressed against every joint, every line of chinking, every place where wood met wood imperfectly. Even gaps too small to see became doorways. Cold air pushed in. Warm air was pulled out. The wall itself became a pump. This was why cabins could feel cold even with a roaring fire. Heat was not failing. It was being carried away. Jonas's vertical boards changed that equation. The outer skin met the wind first and broke its force. Air slowed, lost pressure, and scattered across the surface instead of driving straight into the structure. What little cold air entered the narrow cavities behind the boards could not move freely. Each pocket trapped it in place. And still air, unlike moving air, does not steal heat quickly. Inside those thin vertical spaces, air had nowhere to go. It could not circulate. It could not rise and fall in loops that carried warmth away. Heat reaching those pockets slowed, spread, and weakened before it ever touched the logs behind them. This mattered more than thickness. A solid wall conducts heat straight through itself. A wall divided by small, sealed spaces forces heat to take the long way around. Every pause, every pocket, every layer reduced its strength. The result was not dramatic warmth. It was stability. Jonas's cabin did not feel hot. It felt steady. When the fire burned low, the temperature did not collapse. When the wind howled, the walls did not answer. The outer boards took the punishment. The inner logs stayed calm. Modern builders would later give names to this idea: air barriers, pressure brakes, cavity walls. They would measure it, test it, and sell it back to the world in rolls and panels. Jonas needed none of that. He knew only that heat behaved best when it was not chased. You could not force it to stay. You could only make it comfortable enough to linger. And the quiet space between his walls did exactly that. The change came overnight. On the evening of October 15th, the prairie still looked manageable. The sky was heavy but unbroken, the air cool without being cruel. A few men lingered outside after supper, finishing small chores, believing they had seen worse many times before. By morning, the land was unrecognizable. Snow did not fall. It arrived. Wind drove it sideways in dense sheets, erasing fence lines, swallowing paths, and turning familiar ground into a shifting white wall. Visibility collapsed to a few yards at best. Temperatures fell with terrifying speed. Comfortable autumn air dragged down into bitter cold before noon had passed. The prairie had opened its gates to the north. Cabins across the settlement sealed themselves shut as families retreated inside. Doors were barred, shutters closed. Fires were fed without pause. What little daylight made it through the storm carried no warmth with it. Within hours, the weaknesses began to show. Chinking that had looked solid days before started to crack as temperature differences widened. Clay shrank. Moss stiffened. The wind found every hairline opening and worried it wider with each gust. Walls that had always felt solid began to breathe. Cold air crept in low, sliding across floors. Warm air escaped high, drawn toward the roof and pulled through seams that could not be seen, only felt. Families moved closer to their stoves, blankets pulled tight. Coats worn indoors. The storm did not ease. For 3 days, the wind howled without rest. Snow piled against walls until some cabins were buried halfway to their windows. Drifts hardened like stone. Chimneys smoked constantly, their plumes torn apart almost as soon as they rose. Men who trusted in tradition fed their fires until their wood piles shrank visibly. Furniture burned. Fence rails disappeared. Anything that would catch flame became fuel. And still the cold pressed in. In Jonas Whitaker's cabin, the storm sounded different. The wind struck the outer boards hard enough to be felt through the structure, but it did not reach the walls within. There was no whistling, no rattling seams. The air inside remained still. He lit his stove carefully, not with desperation, but with routine, one stick at a time. Enough to bring warmth, not chase it. The heat spread slowly and stayed where it was put, while others fought their buildings. Jonas let his work do the fighting for him. Outside, the prairie disappeared beneath snow and noise. Inside, the cabin waited. By the second night of the storm, denial was no longer possible. In the standard log cabins scattered across the settlement, the cold had found its way inside. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, like water seeping through earth. Frost traced pale lines along the chinking, delicate and dangerous. Buckets left near doors skinned over with ice. The air near the floor felt heavy and sharp, while the space near the ceiling grew stifling from overworked stoves. Families adapted the only way they could. Beds were dragged closer to the kitchen. Children slept in coats. Men took turns waking through the night to feed fires that never seemed satisfied. Wood disappeared faster than anyone had planned, each log sacrificed, buying only a little time. The cabins were warm only where the flames were. Everywhere else, winter pressed close. Then there was Jonas Whitaker's place. Those who stepped inside noticed it immediately, even before removing their gloves. The air did not bite. It did not rush toward the door when it opened. It held steady, calm enough that breath did not fog the room. No frost marked the walls. No ice rimmed the water pail. The floor, though cool, did not punish bare feet the way others did. The heat from the stove spread outward instead of climbing and vanishing. Jonas was not feeding the fire constantly. He added wood when it was needed, not when fear demanded it. The stove worked slowly, evenly, its warmth held in place by walls that did not leak it away. The cabin cooled gradually when the fire burned low, losing a few degrees over hours instead of minutes. The difference was not comfort alone. It was energy. While other households burned through wood at an alarming pace, Jonas's pile diminished almost politely. Each log delivered its full value before turning to ash. There was no sense of chasing warmth that refused to stay. Visitors tried to explain it away. They spoke of better placement, of luck, of some hidden advantage they had missed. But the truth was inescapable. The cabins were similar in size, built from the same timber, sitting under the same sky. Only one had been dressed to face the wind. In that difference lay everything. The storm raged on outside, indifferent to effort or tradition. But inside Jonas Whitaker's cabin, winter had lost its leverage. And those who felt it knew this was not chance. The knock came after dark. Outside, the storm had found a second wind. Snow drove low across the prairie, hardened by cold into sharp grains that rattled against wood like thrown sand. The temperature had fallen again, settling deep below anything the season had promised only days earlier. Jonas was seated near his stove, the room lit by a single oil lamp. When the sound reached him, 3 dull strikes, almost lost beneath the wind. He rose at once. At the door stood a man wrapped in a heavy coat. Snow packed into every fold, his breath coming in short, uneven clouds. In his arms he carried a child, limp with exhaustion, cheeks flushed in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The man did not speak at first. He did not need to. Jonas stepped aside, pulling the door wide. The warmth met them immediately, rolling outward like a held breath finally released. Within moments, coats were shed and laid aside. The child stirred as the air changed, his breathing easing as the sharpness left his chest. They spread blankets near the stove, not too close, not too far. Jonas fed the fire a single piece of wood and let it be. The heat settled into the room and stayed. No one spoke for a long time. The storm battered the outer walls, but inside, there was only the quiet sound of iron warming and the steady rhythm of breathing returning to normal. The child slept, free from the shuddering cough that had driven them into the night. By morning, the wind had eased enough to allow measurement. The outside thermometer read far below zero. Inside, the air held steady, warm enough that hands could move freely, warm enough that breath no longer hurt. The walls were dry. The floor was calm. Nothing strained. The man walked the cabin slowly, touching the boards, then the logs beneath where they were visible. He listened, not to words, but to the absence of sound. He had built cabins his entire life. He had never known one that behaved like this. Questions came quietly after that. About nail spacing, board width, where the seams were sealed and where they were left alone. There was no pride left to defend, no reputation worth more than survival. Jonas answered simply. He did not explain theories. He pointed. He showed. He let the building speak for itself. The storm passed, as all storms eventually do. But something else had changed that night. For the first time, the difference between tradition and preparation was no longer an argument. It was a lived fact. The laughter did not return after the storm. In the days that followed, men moved differently through the settlement. They spoke less at the general store, listened more. The confidence that once came easily, earned through years of repetition rather than results, had been shaken by a single, undeniable comparison. Experience had met its equal. Those who had built the most cabins were the first to notice the details they had once ignored. They walked past Jonas Whitaker's place more slowly now. They studied the way the boards met the eaves, how the lower edges floated just above the ground, how the seams were broken and sealed only where the wind demanded it. No one announced a change of heart. Frontier pride rarely allowed for that. Instead, questions appeared. How wide were the boards? How far apart were the nails? Did the logs beneath still need chinking? What failed first, the outer boards or the inner wall? Jonas answered without ceremony. He showed where he had allowed movement and where he had stopped it. He explained why some gaps were left open and others closed tight. He spoke of wind direction, of patience, of building for what would come rather than what had already passed. What surprised many was not the complexity of the method. It was its restraint. There was no excess material inside the wall. No packed filler. No elaborate system. Just wood space, and an understanding of how air behaved when it was denied a clear path. Men who had once dismissed the idea as wasteful began calculating board footage in their heads. They measured their own cabins with new eyes, tracing the paths where cold had entered and heat had escaped during the storm. Winter was far from over. Wood piles were already lower than planned. Chinking repairs waited for warmer days that would not come soon enough. For the first time, the thought took hold that survival might depend less on endurance and more on adjustment. Certainty had kept them warm before. Curiosity might be what carried them through the rest of the season. Spring arrived the way winter had, suddenly and without apology. Weeks of bitter cold gave way to rapid thaws. Snow that had stacked itself against cabins and fence lines collapsed into heavy water, turning the prairie into mud and movement. Creeks swelled beyond their banks. Footpaths vanished. The land exhaled after months of holding its breath. This was when buildings revealed what they had endured. As families emerged to take stock, the damage was impossible to ignore. On many cabins, the chinking had failed outright. Clay had cracked, fallen away, or dissolved into streaks down the logs. Gaps wide enough to slip fingers into marked where walls had shifted under stress. Some logs showed early signs of decay, darkened surfaces where moisture had worked its way in and never fully dried. Inside, stains told their own story. Mineral marks traced where frost had formed and melted again and again. Corners smelled damp. Mold crept along the base of walls that had alternated between freezing and thawing for months. Repairs waited everywhere, demanding time and materials that were already scarce. Jonas Whitaker's cabin told a different story. When he removed a few outer boards to inspect the wall beneath, The logs looked much as they had in autumn. Dry, tight. The chinking remained largely intact, protected from wind and sun, spared the cycles that had punished every exposed joint in the settlement. Inside, there were no frost stains to scrub away, no damp corners, no rot beginning its slow work. The cabin had not fought winter, and so it had not been wounded by it. Men noticed. They counted the repairs they would have to make before the next cold season. Weeks of work, wagon loads of clay and lime, logs that might need replacement sooner than expected. Jonas, by contrast, needed little more than cleaning and inspection. The difference was not cosmetic. It was time. It was labor. It was years added to a structure's life. Winter had tested every wall without bias. Spring delivered the verdict without mercy. And the evidence stood plainly in wood and mud. Some cabins had survived the season. One had endured it. No announcement marked the change. There was no meeting, no vote, no moment when the settlement collectively admitted it had been wrong. On the frontier, lessons rarely arrived that way. They moved instead through observation, necessity, and the quiet copying of what worked. That summer, men ordered lumber differently. Boards once meant only for doors and sheds were now counted by the hundred. Nails were purchased in heavier sacks. Wagons that might have carried fence posts or extra planks for barns returned from the mill stacked high with siding-length boards. The work began slowly, then all at once. Cabins built only a few years earlier gained new outer skins. Some followed Jonas Whitaker's method closely, vertical boards carefully spaced, seams broken with narrow battens on the windward sides. Others adapted it, laying boards horizontally, overlapping them like clapboard, creating the same quiet space between weather and structure. The result mattered more than the form. What these buildings shared was separation. The wind struck the outer layer and stopped there. The inner wall stayed calm. Heat remained where it was placed. Chinking, no longer battered by sun and storm, lasted instead of failing. Logs dried properly and aged without decay. People noticed what did not happen. Fewer night repairs. Fewer desperate fires. Fewer children coughing through the winter. Fuel piles lasted longer. Time once spent hauling wood or repacking joints was reclaimed for livestock, tools, and rest. The cabin stopped being an opponent and became an ally. Even newcomers learned quickly. Those arriving after the hard winter did not rely on tradition alone. They asked which houses had stayed warm, which had consumed less wood, which had required the fewest repairs. They built accordingly, measuring success not by appearance, but by performance. Within a few years, the settlement looked different. Exposed log walls became rare. Vertical and horizontal sheathing softened the harsh lines of early frontier construction. To an outsider, it might have appeared that the place had grown more refined, more settled. In truth, it had grown wiser. What began as one man's quiet refusal to trust habit over experience had reshaped how a community understood shelter. Not through argument, not through theory, but through survival. And that kind of knowledge, once learned, is never unlearned. Long after the snow melted and the ground hardened again, the lesson remained. Winter did not defeat those cabins by strength alone. It did not break them with cold. It tested them patiently, hour after hour, searching for the smallest weakness. A seam left unprotected, a joint allowed to breathe, a wall asked to do more than it was meant to. The wind always finds those places. On the frontier, survival was never about proving toughness. It was about understanding limits, of bodies, of materials, of fire itself. The men who endured learned that heat was precious not because it was hard to create, but because it was easy to lose. Jonas Whitaker never set out to change how people built. He built for his own survival, guided by memory, observation, and respect for forces that could not be argued with. He trusted that would behave a certain way, that air carried warmth when allowed to move, and that stillness was often more powerful than strength. What saved his cabin was not extra fire. It was restraint, a second skin that took the weather so the structure did not have to. A quiet space where air was held still and warmth could rest. A willingness to spend time and resources before the crisis arrived, rather than after. Those ideas did not stay in Dakota territory. They resurfaced wherever winters were long and fuel was dear. In mountain cabins wrapped by barns. In homes built within homes. In walls thickened not by mass alone, but by intention. Today, the language has changed. We speak of efficiency, of insulation, of energy loss. but the principle is the same. When the wind comes looking for a way in, it is not impressed by tradition. It does not care how something has always been done. It only tests what stands before it. The frontier taught that lesson quietly, in wood and air and patience. And it remains worth remembering, because winter, in one form or another, always comes again.